So we're going to have Stephanie come back up on the stage and talk about some of her work broadly and the work of Gallup in thinking about the things that are part of the students' educational experiences and how Gallup has tracked that, and again, in a broad sense. This is all part of what we are doing within CLTE. Right from the very beginning of today, we heard Rick talking about evidence-driven operations and evidence-driven directions for the CLTE, and in particular, based on some of the Gallup data that we have seen, that other people have seen, that we've based a lot of our work on. And you've heard that repeated throughout the day from various speakers about the importance of the data and the importance, honestly, of Gallup in all of this. So we thought we would give you a little bit more background on what Gallup has done. Stephanie's going to do that for you. And then we have two of her colleagues, or one of her colleagues coming up here, another one of her colleagues supporting with additional questions if necessary, with the work that Gallup in particular has done for and with the CLTE Gallup survey. So we have Zach Hernowski coming up. We have Nicole Wilcoxon, who's also here to contribute to the conversation. Zach will be talking about, again, the CLTE Gallup survey that we've been working on, some of the ways we've phrased questions and some of the results that we've gotten out of that. And I should say right up from the front that really Gallup has been a tremendous partner for us in all of this work. We've had endless conversations about how to structure the questions that we've asked, are continuing to ask. We've done the survey once, you'll hear more about this from Zach, and the ways in which we can interpret the data, the ways in which we can look at the data. That's all incredibly important to us. Again, that's a theme for the entire conference, is how do we learn the things that we are doing, about the things that we are doing, and whether they're really having an impact. So Stephanie's going to start for a few minutes and talk about what Gallup has done in general, and then Zach's going to come up and talk more specifically about the CLTE Gallup survey.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for allowing me to go twice here today. Such a treat to be with you all. Thank you to the CLTE team for not just inviting us to participate, but also for the amazing partnership we've so enjoyed. I'm going to kick us off by sharing just a little bit about the Gallup Alumni Survey, which of course is the inspiration for that work. I know a lot of folks in this room are familiar, so I'll try to go through and not bore you too much, but just important few highlights. You know, when we first started the Gallup Alumni Survey in 2013, we did so with real intention. We believed that most of the metrics that were being used to assess the value of a college degree were really economic only. And of course, all of these things are important to track because we know that students are just going on to higher education for the experience of learning. They're going on to higher education to get that great job, to experience that great life upon graduation. They're also going to make sure that they're more employable, more competitive a job candidate. They need to be able to repay their student loans. So all these economic metrics that we often talk about are absolutely foundational and important to assessing overall value of a college degree, but they're also a little short-sighted, right? They're just part of the picture. They really don't tell a holistic picture, especially when you consider why most people go to higher education in the first place. And we've conducted so many surveys about this over the years. I've just selected a few key statistics on this from just a few of the populations for which we've surveyed about the purpose of a college education. We actually have forthcoming data here in the spring in partnership with Lumina Foundation where we ask a really fundamental question that says, education for what? What is education supposed to provide individuals? What does the public perceive as the purpose of higher education? But when we interview currently enrolled students, alumni, parents of currently enrolled students, future prospective parents of currently enrolled students, we consistently find that most people say higher education is about getting a great job and a great life. So we said, well, if it's about a great job and a great life, then we ought to be measuring that, not just these economic metrics and earnings alone. There's been so much talk today about kind of public perception of higher education. We actually have quite a few statistics on our website if you're just interested in this topic. If it goes to news.gallup.com and you just scroll down to education at the bottom, what you'll find is a lot of the insights that we've shared on this topic. But we find generally people are pretty positive about the concept of higher education. Most Americans feel like post-secondary education, any education and training beyond high school, whether it be a 2-year degree, a 4-year degree, a certification, a certificate program, will lead to, quote, a better job and a better life, and you see that portrayed here. Now, the challenge, of course, is they also feel like cost is a limiting factor. It's a barrier keeping them from enrolling. So as you think about reconciling these statistics with what's happening in enrollments nationally, you can clearly see that cost is a factor that most Americans believe is a barrier, if not that they've experienced it themselves as being a barrier. But nonetheless, we find that people are generally pretty positive and believe that higher education is about these two important things, a better job and a better life. So when we sought to develop the Gallup Alumni Survey, we thought, well, we need to ask them a series of questions retrospectively while they were enrolled in college. What did they experience while enrolled? And what are the outcomes that they've now experienced upon graduation? To date, we've interviewed about 105,000 college graduates nationally using a probability-based sampling method. People are randomly selected, lucky them, and they take our survey. And they answer these series of questions about their enrolled experience. They tell us where they went in terms of the actual institution, and then we ask them about their current life today. And when we started that process, we said, well, we have a series of things that we know are high impact practices that students have to have while enrolled. And we know there are these other outcomes that we believe are really important, like engagement in their job upon graduation, well-being across all 5 elements that we measure. That's purpose, social, community, physical, and financial well-being. But we also wanted to add an important set of questions about other outcomes, and this is one of our favorites. We actually asked, how long did it take for you to get a good job upon graduation? And you'll see here just about a quarter of graduates from a 4-year degree granting experience report that they had a good job awaiting them upon graduation. And you'll see it kind of tapers off a little bit. Then we have about a quarter that report that they weren't looking because they were going on to graduate school or maybe already had a job. What's interesting about this research is that when we ask people what made it a good job, because of course that's always the question that we get, several years ago, we actually went through an exercise with students where we said, what made it a good job? What factor was most important? People reported purpose and pay were equally important to defining something as a good job. So if you think about that, purpose and pay are tied in that way in terms of relative importance. It helps you know as an employer what you should be doing to describe yourself to a potential student, but also what you need to be that good job. Now, what's also interesting about this data is that if you had an internship or a job where you were able to apply what you were learning in the classroom, you're twice as likely to report you had a good job awaiting you upon graduation. So again, a really important and relevant skill set, and we'll talk a little bit about those high impact practices. So there are 6 total experiences that we've identified as being really mission critical for an individual student to experience while enrolled in order to increase the likelihood that they're engaged upon graduation and that they experience high levels of well-being across every element of their lives. We call it a relationship-rich education because we have 3 supportive items that we track that comprise this big 6, and you see them here. We've mentioned some of these already today. This issue of having at least one professor who made you excited about learning, which, by the way, as a reminder, needs to mean that they're presenting curriculum that's relevant to the student, has examples that are relevant to their own experiences. Just 64% of college graduates nationally strongly agree with that statement. When we look at this issue of feeling cared for as a person, we find just about a quarter of graduates nationally strongly agree with that statement, 27%. When we ask students to tell us, what does it mean to be cared for as a person, they talk about being seen as an individual, being called by their name, being noticed if they're absent, whether it be by their teacher or their instructor or even a teaching assistant, just that somebody notices that they're absent or that they need extra help. And then we have this last question about having a mentor who encourage you to pursue your goals and dreams, and just 22% of college graduates strongly agree with that statement. If you look across these 3 experiences, it means just 14% of graduates today strongly agree with all 3 of those statements. So we move on to engaging experiential learning opportunities. This rounds out what we call the Big 6 at Gallup. These 3 experiences include having a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. This could be a thesis paper, some sort of practical experience that you were able to engage in long-term and really see some sort of application from a relevancy perspective. Just about a third of college graduates today say that they had such a project. About 30% say they had an internship or job where they were able to apply what they were learning in the classroom, and that second part of the sentence is really important, right? Because when we asked just about a paid job or internship, we found there was no difference if you had a paid job or internship on your engagement upon graduation or your well-being. It had to be one in which you saw some sort of application in terms of what you were learning in the classroom. And then on this issue of extracurricular activities and organizations, we find that deep commitment, and experiences within the campus culture obviously have a huge impact on your engagement and well-being upon graduation. They also increase significantly the likelihood you are to donate back to that institution. 20% of our graduates strongly agree with that statement. It's just 6% have experienced all three of these statements. Does anybody want to guess what percent strongly agree with all 6 statements that I just mentioned? All 3 supportive questions, and all 3 experiential? Just yell it out. 3%? 1%? 3%? 2.7%. Great guesses. Does everybody want to raise their hand if they're one of those 2.7%? I am. No? Just a few? Yeah, that's usually pretty representative, unfortunately. What we find is really interesting with these 6 items is they predict nicely, obviously, well-being and engagement. They also predict the likelihood that somebody feels prepared for life outside of college. So what you'll see here on this chart is that we have on the left-hand side, essentially those who experienced none of those big 6 items. Nobody cared about them as a person. They didn't engage in extracurriculars. What you'll see is 24% of those individuals exist within our database, and just 5% of them report that they felt prepared well for life outside of college. If you move to the right-hand side of the screen, what you'll see is 85% of those who experienced all 6 felt as if they were prepared for life outside of college. We have also looked at the big 6 in terms of engagement, but also pay upon graduation. We talk a lot about this because internships make a huge difference, but also those mentorship experiences make a huge difference in the likelihood somebody's engaged upon graduation. If you think about your own experience while you were enrolled, if you had that great mentor, they usually set you on a path to something that you're really passionate about or excited about, but they also give you a lot of practical information about what you could expect from the field, the likelihood that you might be experiencing some sort of a marginalized experience while in that workforce. They give you a lot of tips and tricks along the way that really set you up nicely upon graduation to orient to a better job that also often has better pay associated with it. And that's what you see here. So again, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see 25% of those who experienced none of those big 6 items were engaged at work. 65% who had all 6 experiences were engaged at work. So it's absolutely the case you can do something to maximize engagement upon graduation. You know, it's often the case is that internship, and it's not always that that internship leads to a good job, but that most people assume that. It's also sometimes that the internship allows a student to eliminate something that they never want to do again, and that's great as well. I'm going to leave it there because Zach's going to dive into the individual data, so I'm going to let him do that, but happy to take questions afterwards as well.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah. And these 2 presentations are clearly linked, so we'll definitely take questions for either one of them once we get to the end. Zach.
Well, thanks, Keith, and to John and Rick as well for the opportunity to speak to you all about this important work. And thank you all for your commitment to being here. And thank you particularly for allowing me to say that Robert Waldinger opened for me. That's a really big, important takeaway for me. So I'm going to talk, as Stephanie mentioned, about some of the specific findings and underpinnings of the CLTE work in the context of what Gallup has done nationally, which is what Stephanie just oriented you to. And sorry, I'm having the same problems here getting this to advance. There we are. There we are. So John was very kind to share his slide with me, and these are those items that Stephanie just talked to you about around those supportive student experiences as well as the experiential learning experiences. And one of the big underpinnings of the foundation of CLTE is making sure that students have not only the experiences that we want them to have at university up to the point of graduation, but also that they're seeing the benefits of those well beyond graduation, those being in the form of workplace engagement, which translates to you're having a job that's purposeful and you enjoy, as well as well-being in 5 areas that Gallup measures, those being career and purpose, social, financial, community, physical. Now, one of the reasons that I'm going to talk to you very briefly about purpose, which I'm glad that I've had about 8 hours worth of lead up to the importance of purpose. Is it the green button, John? Oh, well, that would be is that overall well-being is heavily influenced by the quality of your job. So, CEO of Gallup, John Clifton, has just released a book about global well-being, and it's called Blind Spot: The Global Rise of Unhappiness and How Leaders Missed It. And what we found in that book is that jobs have an incredibly outsized influence on not only how happy you are in the 8+ hours that you spend at your job, but also the time that you spend outside of it. And so that Gallup's research finds that if you are engaged and thriving in your work, you experience less stress, sadness, anger, pain, and worry every day, and you have better positive affects. You are more likely to feel happy throughout the day. You're more likely to laugh during the day, to feel like you're respected. And so while we feel it's important to measure all 5 of these areas and domains of well-being, what Gallup research finds is that purpose well-being is really the underpinning of all of those other things. And of course, what you unfortunately see if you were to look at Google, most people are not finding that their job is purposeful. They're saying it's soul crushing, it's killing me, it's too stressful. But of course, Gallup has better data than Google search on whether folks are feeling these positive affects. And what we find, just very briefly here, and we'll send out these slides so you don't have to write all these down, but the takeaway here is that not only is a great job going to increase your positive affects and reduce your negative affects, having a miserable job, what we would call those actively disengaged folks, is actually worse for your life than being unemployed. So it's really important as folks in higher education that we're making sure that students are not only getting a job, but that they're getting a great job. Now, our work with Bates found that purpose in work, not just a paycheck, not just promotions, not just security, but actually enjoying what you do, is the best indicator of whether you're going to be thriving in your overall well-being. So college graduates who say, yes, my work is highly purposeful, were 10 times more likely to be thriving in their overall well-being in all of these other areas than those who had low purpose in their work. And what we are finding, as Stephanie mentioned, is that purpose overall, in terms of great jobs across the United States, is commensurate with pay in terms of what's important to you in a job. We're finding that younger generations, millennials, and the emerging research around Gen Z is that purpose is actually starting to emerge as more important than pay for those younger generations. Unfortunately, what you see on this graph here is that when we studied this with Bates, we found that less than half of college graduates reported having any workplace experiences that were associated with high purpose. So 40% of students or former students said that they had found a meaningful career. And that was the high watermark of any of these metrics. But if you start going down the line, do you like what you do every day? Do you learn or do something interesting every day? Only about a quarter of college graduates are reporting that they strongly agree that they learn, do something interesting every day, that they like what they do every day. And so if our imperative as folks in higher education is to get students into this type of job, there's definitely work to be done. It's also important to note that students have this expectation of their experience. It's not just us knowing through the research that this is what's important. It's also students who are telling us that the reason I'm going to college and the reason I'm pursuing my education is to pursue a fulfilling career and to get a good job or a career. So when a student, if we're thinking about, as Rick often says, restoring trust and that type of trust in higher education as an institution, we need to make sure that we're giving students what they expect from that experience. So as Stephanie previewed, this is just a slightly different way of visualizing these data, is that those big 6 items that we talked about and that are the underpinning of the CLTE survey is a linear and additive effect on whether students are thriving in their purpose after graduation, whether they feel like the ideal job for them, and whether they're deeply interested in the work that they do. Now, of course, getting students to those big six experiences is a big hurdle. There are institutional barriers to things like internships. You may not be able to, as a student, afford to take an unpaid internship. You may not be able to participate heavily in extracurricular activities if you have other non-educational responsibilities. But the fact that about half of students had 2 or fewer of those big 6 experiences by the time they graduated is really troubling to me, because from my perspective, 3 of those things, student support metrics, whether you have a mentor, whether you have a professor who cares about you, whether you are excited about what you're doing in the classroom, Everything does require, to an extent, what we talked about earlier, that discretionary effort where faculty and staff need to take the time to educate those students, but it's something that every student should be able to attain, and I think what many of them expect as sort of a bare minimum, that when I'm in the classroom, I feel cared about, I feel excited about what I'm learning, and I have someone there who can help me, who encourages me to pursue my goals and dreams and can help me attain them. So what you see is if you do get to that 6 experiences, you have incredible outcomes where 80+% of these students are thriving in their purpose after they graduate if they have them. But even if we could get every student in the United States to have half of those experiences, just 3 to feel supported, you're talking about 50% of students who are thriving in their purpose well-being, which, as you can see from the prior graph, would be an almost doubling of where we're at right now if we could just get students to feel supported in the classroom, and everything after that is just a bonus. So all of that data was predicated on alumni. These are graduates who already we have jobs, we know whether they're thriving in their lives or not, but part of the reason that we started this survey with CLTE is to measure this while it's happening. One of my favorite Peter Druckerisms is what gets measured gets managed. And so if you don't know where you stand with your students while they're there, you're gonna have a very difficult time intervening and making sure that they have those experiences that we all just established are very important. So what we've done with the coalition is come together with, in the first iteration of the survey, 8 universities, which are incredibly diverse. We have large publics, small liberal arts, to see how are students doing in the moment. And when they tell us that they're not having these experiences, what can we do to intervene? And when we have intervened, are those interventions having the impacts that we want them to have? So we surveyed over 5,600 students in early 2022 from March to April. And what we found was that of those students who are currently enrolled in all of these diverse institutions, about 26% of them strongly agreed that their professors care about them as a person, and 24% of them say that they have a mentor who encourages them to pursue their goals and dreams. Now, what I should say is that it's very difficult to put these up directly against alumni studies because those are students who have gone through all 4 years of their education and they're looking retrospectively. So I don't want to put these up as one-to-one benchmarks, but just to get a sense of where students are saying, I'm not having the experiences that I need to have and that I expect to have, feeling cared about by their professors and feeling like they have a mentor are those areas where we were struggling a little bit. One other thing to note contextually, of course, is this was in 2022. So at that time, some students were still either hybrid or fully remote. And so one of the instructive things that we'll be seeing in future surveys is whether the return to the classroom as that continues will improve some of these metrics. I did want to make a special aside for mentorship because as Dr. Waldinger said earlier, there are studies being done nationally about whether people have confidants and whether they have someone that they can trust. And of course, during the pandemic, these feelings of despair and difficulty dealing with things that are not only in the classroom, but oftentimes superseding the experiences that they're having in the classroom were really impacting the way that they experience their education. And when you ask students, do you have a mentor at college? If they said yes, we asked a follow-up to that question and asked, well, what do you talk to that mentor about? How does that mentor support you? And of course, we see, as you would expect, 87% and 86% respectfully say that they were advised on the more traditional aspects of academic issues and career. But you also find that more than half of students talk to these mentors at the university about their physical and mental health or about their personal life and relationships. And so these mentors are providing not only those experiences that you would expect, guiding them through their academic paths, recommending curriculum, maybe how to get into a job that they want. They're also supporting them in ways that are far outside the classroom and that we also know are really impactful in helping students to achieve not only those supportive aspects, but also the higher order things like having the ability to do an internship or to participate in extracurricular activities. If you're not feeling supported or able to do those things as a result of your physical and mental health, having a mentor as an intervention is a really critical aspect of that. We also asked them, of course, about the 3 experiential education experiences, those being whether you had an internship, whether you had a project or a semester-long, you worked on a semester-long project, or that you were extremely active in extracurricular activities. You can see that the outlier there generally is extracurricular activities. I think, again, that's partly contextual as a result of where we surveyed in 2022. Extracurriculars from a remote standpoint would be very difficult to participate in. But we do know that these extracurricular activities, internships, and semester-long projects do lag behind the participation or the reporting of those student support experiences. Now, if you look from a distribution standpoint of just a raw count, how many of these Big 6 experiences did you have among CLTE students, you can see that about half of them are in that 0 to 1 category, and a very few, about 7%, reported that they had either 5 or 6 of those Big 6 experiences. Again, with the caveat that many of these students are first-year students and they have 3 more years to experience this. We looked into that. And what we did see was if you segregate this out by class year, you do see a marginal increase year over year from first-year students all the way up to seniors or fifth years in the number of these experiences that they're reporting. But even when you get students to that 4th year and they're, I would say, 3/4 of the way through their senior year, the average number of these 6 experiences that these students were having was about 2.5. So yes, we do see marginal increases over time, but it's not something that just organically happens, and students are not just stumbling into these experiences as they progress. It's going to take really intentional efforts to make sure that these students are reporting all 6 of these. We also saw that in addition to not having these Big 6 experiences increase organically over time, we also asked students whether they felt like their university was preparing them well for life outside of college. And what we see, again, if you segregate that by class year, they are not organically reporting that they're better prepared as they go through. A first-year student is about as likely to strongly agree they're being prepared for life outside of college as a senior. But if you overlay that with the number of experiences, and this is very small, so don't worry about it. Again, the slides will go out. The takeaway from this slide is that no matter what year in school you're in, the more Big 6 experiences you are reporting, the more likely you are to report that you're being prepared well for life outside of college. So we had established this in our prior alumni research retrospectively. We also know now through CLTE survey data that current students feel this in the moment, that they are not feeling well prepared for life outside of school if they're not having these supportive and experiential education experiences, and it's true regardless of where they fall within their academic journey. We also know that in addition to improving students' perceptions of their preparedness for life outside of college, that again, in the moment while they are a student, their life evaluation, how well they evaluate their life on a 0 to 10 scale today, and how well they think they will evaluate their life in 5 years is also directly correlated. And you can see this is, I didn't make these numbers up, you don't see linear numbers like this all that often. Every single experience, in addition to the prior one that a student has, is additive benefit to their life evaluation. It's also additive to their emotional attachment to the university. So if students feel cared about, if they feel like they're having experiences that they couldn't have had elsewhere, they're more likely to agree that their university was the perfect place for students like them, and that they can't imagine a world without that university. Now, that often tracks with things like well-being, and it tracks with things like likelihood to recommend, but emotional attachment on its own creates alumni who are deeply invested in their alma mater and are willing to come back to the university as volunteers, to act as a bridge to future graduates. If they get a job, they're more likely to reach back out to their alma mater and say, I'll take interns. So creating students who are emotionally engaged creates not only fiduciary benefits, where they're more likely to donate back to the university, it also starts to create these bridges for future students, and so it's critically important. One last metric that's not on here, but that I like to talk about because, again, it speaks to Rick's restoration of trust in higher education, is likelihood to recommend. So if you all have heard of the Net Promoter Score on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this thing? If you ask that of students of their own university, how likely are you to recommend your university to others? Big 6 experiences are also predictive of that. And if you have students who are graduating from their universities and saying, I am a 10 out of 10 on my likelihood to recommend this university, I think everybody who should have the same experience that I did, that's going to go a long way to restoring trust, not only among current students who have undergone that experience, but also their parents, their friends, and future students. So this Big Six is important not only to purpose and life preparation, but also some of these wider macro issues that we're contending with in higher education. But we aren't only looking at these Big Six experiences. The survey is about 50 items, and just to give you a taste of some of the other constructs that are really important that we're measuring in tandem with the Big Six are things such as diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're asking students, do you feel like you're treated with respect by your faculty, staff, other students while you're at this university? And of course, we're able to disaggregate those data by race, by gender, by sexual orientation to see not only are students feeling cared for in the ways that Gallup knows impact their post-graduation outcomes, but also whether they're feeling respected in the moment. That would contribute to things like persistence, retention, et cetera. What we've found so far is that CLTE undergraduates are about twice as likely as, black CLTE undergraduates are about twice as likely as students of other races and ethnicities within these institutions to report that their school is not a good place for racial and ethnic minorities. So one of the things that is beneficial of our relationship with CLTE is our ability to be iterative. And when we see something in the data like this, where black students within these very diverse institutions are reporting a disparate experience, we can dig into why that might be. What are some of the drivers and predictive factors of whether a student feels the school is a good place for people like them? And we've also asked the same thing about sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's just one example of the iterative nature of the survey. In year one, what we were doing was establishing baselines, so we now know prior to any interventions that we're measuring how were students feeling across these institutions. But of course, the next step is to then look at those data, start managing what we've measured, and measuring whether those interventions are having the experiences and the results that we want them to have. So in year two, we're actually underway. We've surveyed with a handful of CLTE institutions, and there's another wave coming in April. And what we're going to be able to do is trend data across institutions and say from year one to year two, how are things looking? We can also do advanced analysis on those and again look at the drivers for students who are longitudinally are having a better experience. Is it because they enrolled in something like a RLE at the University of Maine or some other grant-based activity at their institution? And we can start to say, are the things that we're trying to do having the effects that we want them to have? We're also working to integrate new university partners, of course, because these are all diverse in university environments, and what may work for a large public R1 might not work for a small private institution. And so we need to expand our base to have as many different experiences as possible documented within these data so that we can start making larger trend and coalition-wide observations. And so if any of you in this room feel like you don't have the data that you need to make the decisions that we just talked about on this slide, I would encourage you to reach out to Rick, to John, to Keith, to my colleague Nicole. We would love to have more folks in the fold. The more data we have, the better. The more data we have, the better decisions we can make for students and start really ensuring that not 25% of students after they graduate are having these really purposeful lives, but that we're starting to really increase those metrics over time. So with that, Keith, I don't know how we're doing for time, but I'd love to take any questions.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what Zach was saying, we are, of course, looking for more people to participate in the survey. We did it last year, we're doing it again this year. We hope to continue it in the future, so if there is interest, definitely get in touch with us. But we do have time for questions. Yes?
Hi, Zach.
Hi,
I had
Amy.
a question that kind of ties together some of the mental health conversation panel before to this one. When we ask students about their mentors, do we ask about their gender, and do we see if there's more women who are carrying this load of how they're engaging in mentorship, specifically around those additional elements that aren't just academic and career-focused ideas?
That's a really great question. It's one that we didn't ask on the survey as a follow-up, and I don't think, Stephanie, we've ever asked about the gender. Sorry.
We've asked briefly with one university actually about the gender and also the race ethnicity of the mentor, and we actually didn't see a measurable impact in terms of the quality of the mentorship based on the identity, but it was just one institution, so I'm always cautious about saying that. But I will say there are really important gender differences on this issue of well-being for that we are seeing in the data. We're just about to release a report with Lumina Foundation from the State of Higher Education study we conduct with them each year. Dives really deeply into mental health and well-being, and what it shows is female students are actually reporting higher levels of emotional stress as a reason they've considered stopping out than their male peers. So as you think about like what could you do to best support female students in particular, it definitely looks different than some of their male peers in terms of the challenges they're experiencing. So if anybody has other data, I'd love to see it on that gender or race ethnicity question, because I think it's something we continue to wonder about.
One of the other things I would just add to that is we have asked about the role of the person. So is this mentor your coach? Is it a professor? Is it a extracurricular advisor? And what we do find is that, as Stephanie mentioned with things like gender, we don't find meaningful differences in, for example, the quality of advising from a faculty member versus a staff member versus a coach. What's really important is whether you have that person or not. And so what we do find, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, a lot of faculty right now are struggling with the burden of having one more thing or one more advisee. And so while, of course, students may naturally gravitate to a faculty member if they're taking courses with them, it's not imperative, or it's not only faculty who can provide this. This is an entire ecosystem of faculty, staff, peer advisors, just somebody who you can reach out to who can be that confident that a quarter of Americans are missing. And so faculty are the only constituency that are bearing that burden. I think we're going to find that we burn them out even faster than we already are. And so ensuring that staff and everybody else within the university ecosystem understands that this is a role that they can play and the importance of it, I think that would go a long way towards reducing the burden on some of those populations that you're talking about that maybe bear the brunt of that activity.
Hi, Brittany Poppins-Smith, Arizona State University. Quick question for you about the decision to frame the project experience to a semester. Here at ASU, we have an intense focus on scaling work integrated learning, and a huge portion of this is really based upon industry projects that are embedded into curricular experiences, of which they cannot go an entire semester in many cases based upon our faculty partnerships. So trying to understand a little bit as we look to continue to scale those efforts, and I will say we have a very broad definition of work integrated learning that we're approaching our efforts here at ASU with. But specifically, I'm just curious about that semester length. Was there any data that showed you that length was important comparative to any other length of time? And also a student's understanding of semester, actually defining how long a semester was.
Yeah, so we actually did some cognitive testing when we first developed the item. So originally we had a much longer battery than what you're seeing with the Big Six. We had, I think it was over 100 items in the first administration, then we loaded about another 100 in the second. So we tested about over 200 that had some aspect of what you saw in the Big Six. So for example, we had like professors excited about learning. We asked other questions about like professors teach content that's really relevant to you. So we had versions of each item. We did ask a lot of questions about the long-term project. What we had when we isolated to that question is what we'd seen is other instances weren't as relevant across as many institutions, so we ended up isolating to that item because it not only predicted well the outcomes we were talking about, but there was widespread relevancy. Now, we have looked at other questions around relevancy of curriculum, which is really what we're trying to obviously pick up on in that question, and we find they do have a profound impact on graduates, not only their outcomes, but also their evaluation of the institution. One of those items was an Estrada Education Network study that we conducted with them, where we actually asked how relevant the curriculum was in terms of what they then did later in life. Perceived relevancy was more important than their U.S. News and World Report ranking to predicting their evaluation of whether or not their degree was worth the cost. So relevancy is really what they're looking for in some aspect, but I agree there are other versions we could use with individual institutions that would be a little more relevant. We're just trying to get at, did you do something that you feel like you could apply later in life and that you got more out of and you were able to maximize the experience? It's a great criticism.
So I wanted to just make sure I was understanding something that you said correctly and then trying to put it in context as the way I think about my journey. So, you know, you talked about having a fulfilling career, and I think one of the buttons that you had was that you enjoy your job every day or something like that.
I like what, yeah.
And I am blessed beyond words. I've never enjoyed my job every day.
Me
Never.
either.
I'm hoping that I enjoy it enough that there are not enough bad days that I can remember the good days, so that as I get, and so I'm kind of curious as to why is that the metric, when I just think for me that's just, I would never be able to answer that, though I think I have been blessed. I feel I have a great job, and I'm trying to understand that in context of my lived experience in terms of my career.
It's a great question. So you've picked up on a little bit of a hallmark of our questions at Gallup, and you probably saw this in the earlier presentation where we talked about having a best friend at work. We tend to use really extreme language. It's not that you have to strongly agree with that statement, by the way, in order to be categorized as engaged. A lot of people might agree with that statement, or maybe they're neutral on that statement, and they might still reach our engagement level because other items within the index they're particularly strong on. So I'd say the good news is you don't have to like what you do every day in order to be engaged in your work. I think we all have days that we don't like what we do every day, and that's totally fine. But we use extreme wording because we find that sorts between more highly productive and less productive workforces. Meaning that if you're in a work group unit where you see higher levels of that, you see less absenteeism, less turnover. So our meta-analysis kind of explains this in more detail that we repeat every 4 years with a few million respondents. But you don't have to like what you do every day in order to be that engaged group we talked about. Good question. But bless those people who do.
Hi, thanks. Phil Arthur here from Arizona State University. So, a lot of what you were talking about involved trying to get teachers and professors to be more interested in the students, more engaged, and also what I found interesting was they actually cared about them as a person. And so I'm a PhD student. I've taught a few classes here, and I know other PhD students that teach. We've often gotten the impression that we should be spending most of our time on research, and teaching should not be our priority. It should be something we do and care about, but not prioritize, and go the extra mile and try to establish relationships with students and make them feel important. So how might you, I guess one question would be, do you parcel this between, say, big research universities and liberal arts schools, would be one question, and then how might you incentivize, or if any schools, research schools or liberal arts schools, have they done anything to try to incentivize teachers to actually care about students as people?
That's a really good question. I'll start and then Zach jump in. So we have two items that address this to some extent. We have the mentorship question and then the professors cared about me as a person. I think those two run together, to your good point. So we have looked by R1 institutions, for example, and all other institutions. So we've looked by Carnegie code and classification. We've even looked at individual schools in terms of how they perform on some of these metrics in our database. The benefit of having 105,000, we can cut it a lot of different ways. What's interesting and sometimes counterintuitive is we actually don't see big differences by typology or Carnegie code or classification. R1 institutions, for example, do not lag generally on many of these metrics. There are some questions that we ask that the larger the school, the harder it is to get a higher score. But it's a little bit counter to what you might imagine in terms of how the results break out. There's far more variance institution to institution than there is by typology. And a lot of that's because of the intentionality with how they design their programs. I'll give you a good example. This always shocks people. We work with Western Governors University, and WGU, if you don't know, is a fully online institution, mostly serving adult learners with an increasing number of traditional 18 to 22-year-olds in the mix. They have the largest percentage of mentors we've ever seen in our database because they have an intentional mentorship program. So it's a lot more about the intentionality of the mentorship than the actual way in which you're reaching or teaching students. But you bring up a really good important point on the incentives, because I worry a lot about this and what schools might do with these data. So there's an institution that will remain nameless. Years ago, they saw our data and said, we have problems around mentorship. We're going to make all of our faculty members cross a mentorship barrier in order to get tenure. And if you've ever been mentored by somebody who doesn't want to mentor, it's not a really amazing experience. It actually has the opposite effect as what you intended. And I was like, oh, that's not really what we mean, right? We want them to have a mentor, but it doesn't have to be the faculty member. This was an R1 institution. They had an amazing research program. And so they were forcing these faculty who were so energized by their research and so energized by what they were contributing to the field to engage in this artificial mentorship experience. It was just really negative. So I just worry that institutions might go that route. It's not as important, to Zach's point, that the mentor is a faculty member at that R1 institution. It's important that they have someone who encourages them to pursue their goals and dreams. So you could round that out with other individuals, maybe staff members who want to do that job, or other professors who are engaged by doing that job. I mean, some would just love to do that all day. So I think there should be some differentiation by the role.
I just have a really simple question. Like, we've heard the term purpose quite a bit through here. Are we all using the same definition of what purpose is?
Probably not.
And so, like, how would, because, I was at an AAC&U presentation where the presenter really said, purpose is used a lot. Like, I'm really defining this specifically, and it has to be a cause you believe in. You have to persist over time. You have to encounter barriers, and it has to have a sense not just for yourself, but a sense for the world as well. This kind of civic kind of sense of purpose. So I'm not sure how Gallup is using purpose and how others in the room have used purpose today, but at least according to this researcher said it couldn't just be, I have a vague sense of meaning or a vague direction. It really had to be that kind of sense of, I'm persevering, I've encountered difficulties, I'm in it for the long haul.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we even within Gallup, to be honest, have a lot of different items that measure this, so we're not totally consistent either. I will acknowledge that. So we also ask questions about, I found a career with meaning, I found a career with purpose, I found a career in which I could further the mission and purpose that I've always wanted to do. I mean, so we've had so many versions of this item. I will say what's consistent is the items that we presented in terms of those big 6 items do tend to predict those outcomes regardless of how we design them, but we have lots of different versions we've used. In the case of employees, we really look at the combination of a Q12 metric that we use to measure someone's engagement at work, and that's really really an articulation of their purpose within their work and that whether they feel emotionally committed and connected. So I think you bring up a good point. We don't really necessarily measure, did they encounter difficulties, did they persevere, et cetera. When we measure a purpose, we're really looking at their subjective evaluation of whether or not it was something that was aligned to their purpose. But I think you raised a really good point. Zach, anything you'd add?
No, Keith, no notes from me. Keith, you can turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you again. Thanks, Stephanie.